5 months of hard fighting across France and Germany had carved lines into his face that wouldn't fade. The stubble on his jaw was thick, and his uniform bore the stains of diesel fuel, mud, and the endless dust of the advance. He was a stocky man from Norwich, New York, a graduate of military academy who had earned his stripes the hard way, through fire and blood. His men called him Captain Jack, though he was still a first lieutenant. In their eyes, and in his bearing, he had already earned the higher rank. The tank beneath him bore a peculiar name. Painted in white letters across the olive-drab hull, Besotten Jenny. The story behind that name would bring a grin to the faces of his crew, though they'd never tell it in polite company. One of his African-American soldiers had named her after a girlfriend back home who'd done him wrong. The name stuck. Now Besotten Jenny sat on a low hill on the south bank of the Inn River, her engine ticking as it cooled, overlooking the village of Kufstein, just 3 miles from the German border. They had crossed into Austria the day before, leading Combat Command R of the 12th Armored Division on its drive south from Munich. The word through the ranks was that Hitler was dead, shot himself in his bunker in Berlin, rather than face what was coming. The Reich was collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. Soviet forces were crushing the last resistance in Berlin. American and British forces were fanning out across southern Germany and Austria, mopping up the scattered remnants of an army that had once seemed invincible. But the war wasn't quite over yet. Pockets of resistance remained, die-hard SS units who would rather fight to the death than surrender. These men were dangerous, cornered animals who knew what awaited them if they were captured. War crimes, tribunals, rope and justice. So they fought on, without hope, without reason, simply because they couldn't imagine any other ending. Lee folded his map and took another sip of coffee. The battalion had orders to push further south, to secure the area and watch for any last-minute attempts by Nazi leadership to escape into the mountains. There were rumors, always rumors, of an Alpine fortress where Hitler's most fanatical followers would make their last stand. Most of the intelligence officers dismissed it as fantasy, but the patrols continued anyway. Better to check every valley and every village than to let someone slip through. The sound of an engine broke the morning quiet. Lee looked up to see a vehicle approaching from the south, bouncing along the dirt road that led up from the valley. It was a Kubelwagen, the German equivalent of a jeep, and as it drew closer, Lee could see a white flag fluttering from a makeshift pole lashed to the front fender. The tank's gunner, Korporal Eduard Schimke, a quiet kid from New York, with steady hands and a good eye, had already noticed. His hand rested near the turret controls, but he didn't traverse the gun. Not yet. The Kubelwagen came to a stop about 50 yards away. The driver stayed in the vehicle, but the passenger door opened and a man stepped out. He wore the field grey uniform of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, and he carried no weapons. His hands were raised slightly, palms out, in a gesture of peace. The man was in his late 30s, perhaps 40, with the weathered look of someone who had seen too many battles. His uniform was clean but worn, the insignia on his collar marking him as a major. He stood there in the road, waiting. Lee set down his coffee and climbed down from the turret. He unslung his Thompson submachine gun and walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him, Schimke kept the tank's guns trained on the Kubelwagen. The German major didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, tired, but without fear. When Lee was close enough, the German spoke in accented but clear English. "Captain, my name is Major Joseph Gangle. I am not here to surrender. I am here to ask for your help." Lee stopped, his finger near the trigger guard of his Thompson. In 5 months of combat, he had seen a lot of strange things, but this was new. Help with what? He asked. "There is a castle," Gangle said, "about 14 miles southwest of here. Castle Itter. The SS has been using it as a prison. The guards abandoned it yesterday, but the prisoners are still there. Important people, French people, politicians, generals, and the SS is coming back. They will kill everyone. We need to get there first." Lee studied the man's face. There was no deception there, only urgency. "Why should I believe you?" he asked. "Why should I care?" "Because they are prisoners of war. Gangl said simply. Because it is the right thing to do. And because, if the SS gets there first, it will be a massacre. Why are you doing this? Lee asked. You're a German officer. Why risk your neck for French prisoners? Gangl's jaw tightened. Because I am finished with this war. I am finished with what it has made us become. I have fought on two fronts, Captain. I have seen what the SS does. I will not stand by and let them murder innocent people. Not when I can stop it. There was a long silence. Lee could hear birds singing in the trees along the riverbank, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Finally, he nodded. All right, Major. Let's go get your prisoners. What happened next would become one of the strangest chapters in the history of World War II. An American tank commander and a German major, enemies by every rule of war, were about to become allies in a battle that no one would have believed if it hadn't been witnessed by dozens of people. Castle Itter sat high on a hill above the village of Itter, nestled in the Brixental Valley with the Austrian Alps rising all around. It was an old place, its foundations dating back to the 13th century, when it had been built as a medieval fortress to guard the valley. Over the centuries, it had been rebuilt and renovated, and by the early 20th century it had been converted into a hotel, a charming alpine retreat where visitors could enjoy the mountain air and sweeping views of the Tyrolean landscape. But in 1943, the castle had been seized by the SS and turned into something far darker. Under the orders of Heinrich Himmler himself, Castle Itter became a special prison, a subcamp of the Dachau concentration camp system. It was not a death camp, not a place of gas chambers and ovens, but a gilded cage for what the Nazis called Ehrenfling, honor prisoners. These were people deemed too valuable to kill, too important to set free, men and women whose names carried weight in the politics of occupied Europe. The SS believed that these prisoners might be useful as bargaining chips when the war ended, hostages to be traded for favorable terms or clemency. The prisoners at Castle Itter were an extraordinary collection of individuals. There was Édouard Daladier, who had been the Prime Minister of France at the outbreak of the war in 1939. A heavy-set man with a serious demeanor, Daladier had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, Mussolini, and Chamberlain in 1938, an attempt to appease the Führer that had failed spectacularly. He had led France into war, but he had not led it well. When the Germans invaded in 1940, Daladier's government fell, and he was arrested by the collaborationist Vichy regime before being handed over to the Germans. Also, imprisoned at Castle Itter was Paul Reynaud, the man who had succeeded Daladier as Prime Minister in March 1940. Reynaud was smaller, more volatile, a man who had argued for continued resistance even as German tanks rolled through France. He had appointed Charles de Gaulle as a general and had tried to organize the defense of France from North Africa. But the defeatists in his own government had undermined him at every turn. When France surrendered, Reynaud was arrested. The bitter irony was that Daladier and Reynaud, imprisoned together in Castle Itter, had been political enemies for years. They despised each other, and even in captivity they could barely bring themselves to speak. There were generals too. Maxime Weygand, who had taken command of the French military when the German invasion began, replacing another prisoner, General Maurice Gamelin. Weygand had been 73 years old in 1940, a relic of the First World War who had advised surrender when the situation seemed hopeless. After the war, he had even collaborated with the Vichy government. Gamelin, on the other hand, had been blamed for France's catastrophic defeat and had spent much of his captivity in bitter reflection. The two men barely spoke to each other, their shared failure a chasm between them. There was François de la Roque, a right-wing leader who had commanded a paramilitary organization called the Croix de Feu in the 1930s. He had opposed communism with a passion that bordered on fanaticism. But he had also resisted the German occupation and ended up in a concentration camp for his trouble. Léon Jouhaux, a trade union leader and socialist, represented the opposite end of the political spectrum. He and La Roque could not have been more different, and they avoided each other whenever possible. And then there was Jean Baratra, the tennis star. In the 1920s, Baratra had been one of the most famous athletes in the world. part of a legendary French team known as the Four Musketeers, who had dominated international tennis. Tall, athletic, and charismatic, Barretra was called the Bounding Basque for his energetic playing style. He had served as Vichy France's commissioner for sports, but when he tried to escape to join the Free French forces, the Nazis arrested him and sent him to Castle Itter at 57. He was still in remarkable physical condition, his body hardened by years of competition. There were others too. Marie-Agnes Callot, the older sister of General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French; Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger of France who had led the country to victory in the First World War, and a handful of Eastern European prisoners who had been sent from Dachau to work as cooks, handymen, and servants. One of these was Xanomir Kukovic, a Yugoslav communist and resistance fighter who had been imprisoned for his defiance of the Nazis. Another was Andreas Krobat, a Czech cook with a bicycle and a brave heart. Life at Castle Itter had been strange. The prisoners slept in converted hotel rooms rather than barracks. They had access to a library, and they could walk in the courtyard around a medieval fountain. They were served adequate food, and they were treated with a certain cold politeness by the SS guards, most of whom belonged to the Tattenkopfverband, the death's head units that ran the concentration camps. But the politeness was a thin veneer over the brutality that everyone knew lay beneath. The prisoners lived in constant fear that one day the politeness would end and the executions would begin. By late April 1945, that fear had become overwhelming. The prisoners could hear the distant thunder of artillery as Allied forces closed in from the west. They listened at night to the roar of aircraft overhead, American bombers heading to targets deeper in Germany. The guards were nervous, jumpy, whispering to each other in the hallways. Officers from other SS units began passing through the castle, fleeing the advancing Allies, their vehicles loaded with stolen goods and their families in tow. The prisoners knew that the end was near, but they didn't know if they would survive to see it. On the night of April 30th, Edward Vita arrived at Castle Itter. Vita had been the last commandant of Dachau, a brutal man with a face like a brute, as Daladier later described him. He had ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners before fleeing Dachau as American forces closed in. His arrival at Castle Itter terrified the French prisoners. They knew his reputation, knew what he was capable of. They feared that he had come to kill them, to erase the witnesses before the Allies could liberate the camp. But Vita had not come to kill anyone. Early on the morning of May 2nd, in a room lit only by candlelight because the castle's generator had run out of fuel, 2 gunshots echoed through the stone corridors. The guards found Vita's body in his quarters, 1 bullet through his heart, another through his head. The official story was suicide, but some of the prisoners suspected murder, perhaps by one of his own subordinates who didn't want to be associated with the Dachau atrocities. His body was dumped in a shallow grave without ceremony, and the local priest refused to allow him to be buried in consecrated ground. Vita's death unnerved the castle's commandant, Sebastian Wimmer. Wimmer was a career SS officer, a man who had followed orders without question for years. But now those orders no longer came. There was no chain of command, no high command to report to, only chaos. On the morning of May 3rd, Wimmer made a decision. He ordered the remaining guards to abandon the castle. Within hours, they were gone, fleeing into the hills with whatever they could carry. The prisoners took control of the castle. They armed themselves with the weapons the guards had left behind, rifles and pistols and a few grenades. Zvonimir Kukovic, the Yugoslav handyman, volunteered to go for help. He slipped out of the castle under the pretense of running an errand and set off on foot. He didn't head west toward the nearest town, Wgrgl, because he knew German troops were still there. Instead, he went north, toward Innsbruck, walking through the night until he reached the outskirts of the city. There he found an advance party of the American 103rd Infantry Division, and told them about the prisoners at Castle Itter. The Americans promised to send help, but the rescue force never made it. Stopped by heavy shelling and then recalled by their superiors for straying into another division's sector, the would-be rescuers turned back. Back at Castle Itter, the prisoners had no way of knowing whether Kukovic had succeeded or failed. On the morning of May 4th, they decided to send another messenger. Andreas Krobot, the Czech cook, volunteered. He climbed onto a bicycle and pedaled down the winding road toward Wurgel. The town was only 5 miles away, but it might as well have been 50. The roads were filled with retreating German soldiers, SS units setting up roadblocks, armed men with wild eyes and nothing to lose. Krobot managed to reach Wurgel without being stopped, more through luck than skill. He pedaled through the narrow streets, his heart pounding, until he was pulled off the road by a German officer. Krobot thought he was finished, thought he was about to be shot, but the officer's eyes were different from the SS men he'd seen on the road. There was no cruelty there, only weariness. The officer was Major Joseph Gangl, and the moment Krobot told him about the prisoners, Gangl made his decision. He had been a soldier for years, had fought in France, in Russia, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He had survived Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. He had seen things that would haunt him for whatever time he had left, but he was done. Done with the madness, done with the killing, done with serving a regime that had brought nothing but death and ruin to his country. He had secretly joined the Austrian resistance, using his position to protect civilians from SS reprisals. Now he had a chance to do something that mattered. Gangl had only about 20 men under his command, and he knew it wasn't enough to defend the castle against the SS units roaming the area. So he did the unthinkable. He climbed into his Kubelwagen, raised a white flag, and drove north toward the American lines. That's how he ended up standing in the road in front of Captain Jack Lee's tank, asking an enemy for help. Lee assembled what he could: his own tank, Besotten Jenny, another Sherman commanded by his friend Lieutenant Harry Bass, nicknamed Bosch Buster, 3 more tanks from a different unit, a few squads of infantry. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With Gangl leading the way, they set off for Castle Itter. The road to the castle was treacherous. They had to cross an old bridge that groaned under the weight of the Shermans. When the 5th tank tried to cross, the structure collapsed, sending the tank tumbling into the shallow river below. The crew escaped, but the tank was done. Lee ordered the infantry to turn back. He couldn't wait for them to find another way across. Time was running out. He pressed on with 2 tanks, 14 American soldiers, and 10 of Gangl's German troops packed into a truck. 6 miles from the castle, they ran into an SS roadblock. Machine gun fire erupted from the tree line, bullets clanging off the armor of Besotten Jenny. Lee ordered Shimsik to open fire, and the tank's main gun roared. The SS troops scattered, but not before one of the African-American soldiers riding on the back of the tank was grazed by a bullet. They pushed through, leaving the roadblock in ruins. As they approached the castle, Gangl told Lee about another problem. The bridge just before the village of Itter had been wired with explosives, ready to be blown. They stopped, and Gangl's men carefully cut the wires and removed the charges while American soldiers kept watch. Once the bridge was secured, Lee made another hard decision. He ordered Lieutenant Bass to stay behind with Bosch, Buster, and guard the bridge. It was their only line of retreat, and it couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. That left Lee with 1 tank, Besotten Jenny, 7 American soldiers, 10 German troops, and the slim hope that reinforcements would arrive in time as the sun began to set on May 4th. Besotten Jenny rumbled up the hill to Castle Itter. The castle gate stood open, and the prisoners were waiting. Paul Reynaud later wrote that Lee was crude in both looks and manners, a rough American with a cigar clamped between his teeth and a voice like gravel. But to the prisoners, who had been abandoned by their own guards and left to face the SS alone, Lee and his men were the most beautiful sight in the world. Lee didn't waste time with pleasantries. He climbed down from Besotten Jenny, surveyed the castle's defenses, and started issuing orders. The tank was positioned at the main gate, its gun covering the road. American and German soldiers took up positions along the walls. The prisoners, despite Lee's protests, armed themselves with the weapons left behind by the guards and refused to stay inside. Former Prime Ministers Daladier and Renaud, two bitter political rivals stood side by side with rifles in their hands. General Weygand, 75 years old, took a position near the gatehouse. Jean Barretro, the tennis star, moved with the grace and energy of a man half his age. There was one more addition to the defense. Among the prisoners was an SS officer named Kurt Siegfried Schrader. He had been recovering from wounds at Castle Itter and had stayed behind when the other guards fled. Schrader was young, in his 30s, and he had become friends with some of the prisoners during his time there. He had brought his wife and children to the castle, hoping to protect them from the chaos outside. When the prisoners asked him to help organize their defense, he agreed. It was a stunning reversal. An SS officer, fighting alongside Americans, Germans, and French prisoners against his own comrades. As night fell, the castle became a strange fortress. American and German soldiers shared cigarettes and rations. Lee and Gangle discussed tactics, their mutual respect growing with each passing hour. The French prisoners, despite their age and their years of captivity, moved through the castle with determination. They had lived too long in fear, and now they had a chance to fight back. Around midnight, the SS reconnaissance units arrived. They probed the castle's defenses with rifle fire, testing the resolve of the defenders. Machine gun fire echoed across the valley, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. The defenders fired back, driving the SS troops into the tree line. The reconnaissance teams withdrew, but everyone knew it was only the beginning. The real attack would come at dawn. Lee radioed for reinforcements, using Besorten-Jenny's radio to contact the 142nd Infantry Regiment, which was somewhere to the north. The radio signal was weak, the connection cutting in and out, but Lee managed to get the message through. Help was on the way. The question was whether it would arrive in time. As the first light of May 5th broke over the mountains, the SS attack began. There were between 100 and 150 of them, soldiers from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, hardened veterans who had nothing left to lose. They came from the east, moving through the trees, using the terrain for cover. They had brought heavy weapons, an 88mm anti-tank gun and a 20mm flak gun, both set up on a hill 800 yards from the castle. The 88 was a fearsome weapon, the same gun that had destroyed so many Allied tanks during the war. Its flat trajectory and high velocity made it deadly accurate. The first 88mm shell screamed through the air and slammed into the upper floor of the castle's main building, demolishing General Gamelin's empty room in a shower of stone and dust. The second shell hit moments later, and Corporal Shimsik, in the turret of Besorten-Jenny, barely had time to react. He was preparing to fire at SS troops in the village when the shell struck the tank's hull. The explosion rocked the Sherman, and Shimsik threw open the hatch and jumped out, running for cover behind the castle gate. Seconds later, the tank's fuel tanks ignited, and Besorten-Jenny became a blazing inferno. The defenders had lost their most powerful weapon. The SS infantry charged. They came in waves, sprinting across open ground toward the main gate, firing as they ran. The defenders met them with a wall of rifle and machine gun fire. American and German soldiers fought side by side, their voices mingling in shouts of warning and encouragement. The French prisoners, despite their age, held their positions and fired with grim determination. Daladier and Reynaud, the two former prime ministers who had despised each other for years, fought together without a word of their old grievances. Michel Clemenceau, the 70-year-old son of the Tiger of France, fired methodically, his hands steady despite the chaos. The battle raged through the morning. The SS pressed the attack, and the defenders held them back. But it was a near thing. Ammunition was running low. The 20mm flak gun raked the castle walls, chipping away at the medieval stone, sending fragments flying. Several of the defenders were wounded, including Schrader's wife, who was hit by falling debris. Major Gangle moved through the castle, repositioning men, shouting orders, his presence a steadying force in the chaos. At one point, Gangle saw former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud standing too close to a window, exposed to sniper fire. Without thinking, Gangle ran toward him, shouting for Reynaud to get down. A shot rang out, and Gangl staggered. The bullet had come from an SS sniper hidden in the village, a 7.92mm Mauser round that punched through Gangl's chest. He fell, and the men around him knew immediately that the wound was mortal. Reynaud knelt beside him, this German officer who had given his life to protect a French politician, and in that moment the bitterness of old wars seemed to fall away. Gangl died within minutes, the only defender killed in the battle. By early afternoon, the situation was desperate. The defenders were almost out of ammunition. The SS had nearly breached the walls. Lee's radio operator, who had survived the destruction of Bissot and Jenny, managed to repair the tank's radio and sent another plea for help. But there was no response. It was Jean Barretre who made the next move. The tennis star approached Lee with a wild idea. Someone had to get through the SS lines and reach the American forces to the north. Someone fast, someone who could run like hell and not stop, Barretre volunteered. He was 57 years old, but he was still in peak physical condition, and he had spent his life running. Lee looked at the Frenchman and nodded. "Go," he said. Barretre climbed onto the castle wall, took a deep breath, and vaulted over. He hit the ground running, sprinting across 40 meters of open ground, while bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. The SS troops saw him and opened fire, but Barretre was too fast, his legs pumping, his body moving with the instinct of decades of competition. He reached the tree line and disappeared into the forest. The SS sent men after him, but Barretre knew the terrain, and he was gone. For nearly 2 hours he ran. He dodged SS patrols, leaped over fallen logs, splashed through streams. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, but he didn't stop. Finally, he saw them, American soldiers from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, setting up a position on the road. He stumbled into their midst, gasping, his uniform soaked with sweat. A French-Canadian reporter embedded with the unit, a young journalist named René Levesque, who would one day become the Premier of Quebec, recognized Barretre immediately. The tennis star explained the situation, and the Americans mobilized. Back at Castle Itter, the defenders were on their last legs. The SS infantry had reached the base of the walls, and were trying to force the gate. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the courtyard. An American soldier bayoneted an SS trooper who had climbed through a shattered window. General Weygand, despite his age, swung a rifle like a club, fighting with the desperation of a man who knew there would be no quarter given. And then, like a miracle, they heard the sound of engines, heavy engines, the rumble of trucks and the clank of tank treads. The 142nd Infantry Regiment came roaring up the road, a relief force of over 100 men with armor support. The SS troops, who had been so close to victory, suddenly found themselves caught between the castle defenders and the advancing Americans. The SS fought for a few more minutes, then broke and ran. The Americans pursued, capturing nearly 100 SS prisoners in the process. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. The French prisoners were evacuated that evening, loaded into trucks and driven north. They reached Paris on May 10th, 5 days after the battle, just as the world was celebrating the end of the war in Europe. Germany's unconditional surrender had been signed on May 7th, 2 days after the battle. The war they had helped start, the war they had tried to fight, the war that had destroyed their country and cost millions of lives, was finally over. For the survivors, the battle became a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Paul Reynaud wrote about it in his memoirs, describing Lee as crude but brave. Jean Barretre became a hero in France, his run through enemy lines the stuff of legend. The prisoners who had fought these elderly politicians and generals had proven that courage was not the exclusive domain of the young. Captain Jack Lee was promoted to captain, a rank his men had always believed he deserved, and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in the United States Army. He returned home to New York, married, had children, and worked as a businessman. He rarely spoke of the war, and when he did, he described the Battle of Castle Itter simply as just another mission. He died in 1973, and his story was largely forgotten until historians began to piece together the details decades later. Major Joseph Gangl was buried, with full military honors, by the Austrian resistance. A street in the town of Wgrgl was named in his honor, and he became a national hero in Austria. His widow received condolences from both American and French officials, a recognition of the extraordinary choice he had made. Gangl had been a Wehrmacht officer, a soldier of the Third Reich, but in the end he had chosen honor over orders, humanity over ideology. His death, shielding a French politician from an SS sniper, became a symbol of redemption in a war that had seen too little of it. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS officer who had fought alongside the Allies, was arrested by American forces after the battle. He was charged for his affiliation with the Nazi Party and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But his sentence was reduced in recognition of his role in defending the castle. He lived quietly after his release, a man haunted by the choices he had made and the uniform he had worn. He died in 1995, his story a complicated reminder that even in the SS, there were men who could choose differently. The prisoners themselves went on to shape the future of post-war France. Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud both returned to politics, their experiences at Castle Itter giving them a unique perspective on the war and its aftermath. They never became close friends, their old rivalries too deep, but they respected each other in a way they hadn't before. The policies they helped formulate in the years after the war, the frameworks for European cooperation and reconstruction, were shaped in part by what they had learned in that Austrian castle. Historian Stephen Harding, who wrote the definitive book on the battle, noted that if the SS had succeeded in killing the prisoners at Castle Itter, the history of post-war France would have been radically different. These men, with all their flaws and failures, were instrumental in rebuilding their country. Jean Barretra returned to tennis, coaching and promoting the sport he loved. He lived to be 95 years old, and in interviews late in his life, he would still light up when talking about the battle. Not the tennis matches, not the fame, but the day he ran through enemy fire to save his fellow prisoners. The Battle of Castle Itter was officially the last battle fought in the European theatre of World War II. It took place 5 days after Hitler's suicide, 2 days before Germany's surrender. It was a battle that defied every rule of war, a battle where enemies became allies, where old men fought like young soldiers, where a German major died protecting a French politician, where an American tank commander trusted a Wehrmacht officer, where an SS officer turned his back on his own comrades. It was a battle that should have been impossible, but it happened. And in its impossibility, it revealed something profound about human nature. That in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, people can still choose to do the right thing. That the lines we draw between enemy and ally, between good and evil, are not as clear as we want them to be. That courage comes in many forms, and redemption is always possible. The castle still stands today, high on its hill above the village of Itter. It's a private residence now, but the stone walls still bear the scars of that final battle. Bullet holes in the medieval masonry, places where the 88mm shells struck, reminders of the day when history took a strange and unexpected turn. The men who fought there, American and German, French and Austrian, are mostly gone now. Their names are recorded in the histories, their stories told and retold. But the lesson of Castle Itter endures, that even in war, even in the midst of hatred and violence, there is room for honor. That enemies can lay down their weapons and stand together. That the choice to do good is always available, no matter the circumstances. May 5, 1945. A cold morning in the Austrian Alps, a castle on a hill. A handful of men who decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the uniform they wore. In the long history of World War II, a war of unimaginable cruelty and suffering, the Battle of Castle Itter stands as a moment of light, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail. This was the last battle of World War II in Europe, and perhaps, in its own way, it was the most important.